Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, and welcome to this week's episode of The Quarterdeck. I am Miguel, the Gunny Signs, and this week on The Quarterdeck, we're going to continue with our journey, with our book, with the 1st Marine Division in 2003, No Greater Friend, No Worst Enemy. And last week, we talked about how the division proceeded to head into Iraq and actually start engaging the enemy as they made their way through the breach sites of the border from Kuwait into Iraq. This week, we're going to talk about Task Force Ripper and what their role was in the process for them to accomplish the mission. And now, as they were moving into Iraq, all the way into Baghdad, and eventually making their way all the way into Tikrit. In our hero highlights this week, we're going to go ahead and take a look at the story of heroism of Gunnery Sergeant Robert Howard McCard, United States Marine Corps.
Drop and give me 25. I'm the gunny.
It's time for the gunning. It's time.
The Quarterdeck. Lights. Get online right now. You got 10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, 0. Hello, my bunch of knuckle-dragging, beer-drinking, hard-charging devil dogs. You're listening to The Quarterdeck. I am your host, Miguel, the Gunny Signs.
Get off the bus!
I do solemnly swear. That I will support and defend the Constitution of the United States. Against all enemies, foreign and domestic.
This week, I want to share with you guys a couple of things. One is that we're going to celebrate St. Barbara's Day, which is the patron saint of artillery. We'll discuss how that is celebrated and how things are done in the Marine Corps and where the heck did artillery even come from. We're going to discuss that. But we're also going to take the time to remember and celebrate the lives of all of those service members who lost their lives today on December 7th. Now, some of you may be saying, what happened on December 7th? It is the remembrance of Pearl Harbor, the attack that occurred in December 7th of 1941. And we'll go ahead and take a look in the remembrance of those individuals who lost their lives that day. First of all, let's talk about who is St. Barbara. She is a saint that is known as the patron saint of artillery in the United States Marine Corps. What is the legend of her, though? Where did it all start? Now, according to the legend, the patron of Saint Barbara, she was a beautiful daughter of a Dioscorius, a nobleman of the Roman Empire. She has been believed to live in Nicomedia in Asia Minor in the 3rd or 4th century. And because of her singular beauty and fearful that she was going to be demanded in marriage and taken away from him and limit the Barbara's exposure due to Christianity and encourage her to the development as a zealous pagan. Her father kept her shut up in the tower, but even as such, concentration, that could not keep the young woman from becoming a Christian. From her window, she looked out upon the surrounding countryside and marveled at the living things that were around her. She concluded that they all must be part of a master plan, and the idols of wood and stone her parents worshipped had to be condemned as false. She received the instruction in Christianity, and she was also baptized. Shortly after embarking on a journey, her father, should I say, he commissioned a sumptuous bathhouse to be built for her, approving the design, of course, before he left. Now, this bathhouse was to be lighted by only 2 windows. In token of her faith, while her father was away, she had another window pierced in the tower. So now she had 3 instead of 2, symbolizing the Holy Trinity. Now, upon his return, Darius asked why she had made this change, and Barbara acknowledged her conversion. Despised all of his threats, she refused to renounce Christianity Now, the Ascaris flew into a rage and dragged her before the local prefect who ordered her death. Imagine that, his own daughter. They had him order her death. The evil Ascaris tortured his daughter, then took her to a high mountain where he beheaded her. Wow, what a father, right? Afterward, as he descended the mountain, he was caught in a sudden violent storm. He was struck down and consumed by lightning, and only his scorched sword remained as a reminder of God's vengeance. As a logical consequence, Barbara began to be regarded as the sainted patron of those in danger from thunderstorms, fire, explosions, and that is to say, sudden death, just like her father had had. Now, given that questionable reliability of early cannon misfires, muzzle bursts, and exploding weapons were not very uncommon during that time. And this is easy to see why the predecessors sought the protection of Saint Barbara, and because she was protected us as artillerymen ever since that time. Saint Barbara was ventured as early as the 17th century, and she had been popular in the East and the West since that time. Those legendary acts of her martyrdom were inserted in the collection of the Simeon Metaphases and by authors Ando and Userd, and they were enlarged metrologies composed during the 9th century in Western Europe. C.K. Charleston celebrates her in a poem. The Ballad of St. Barbara, Patrons of Artillerymen. St. Barbara was ventured as one of the 14 holy helpers in occurrence with the year 1448, did much to further the spread of the veneration of this saint. A man named Henry Knock was nearly burned to death in a fire in Gorkum. He called upon St. Barbara, who aided him to escape from the burning house and kept him alive until he could receive his last sacraments. So St. Barbara is usually represented standing in a tower with 3 windows, carrying a palm of martyr in her hand, and she is often viewed standing by cannon or holding a chalice in sacramental wafer. So as we can see, this is how artillerymen foresee St. Barbara as well, since artillery deals with explosions and all that stuff and everything else. But in order to protect the artillery from lightning and all those things from happening, they believe that St. Barbara is the patron saint that looks over all artillerymen to ensure that they are going to be taken care of. And this is celebrated every single year by artillerymen. Now, the United States Field Artillery Association recognizes this, the tremendous value of St. Barbara's legacy that we just went over, and celebrates and awards associates with her name. So in other words, artillerymen are capable of earning the Medal of St. Barbara because of their accomplishments and what they had put forth to the artillery community. So things that they've done to earn that award. In artillery, this is the highest award that you can possibly receive. To me, when I received my Order of St. Barbara award, it meant more than any other award that I have ever received. And this celebration falls on December 4th every single year. So this week, we celebrated St. Barbara's Day. Now, there is a tradition and everything else that goes through because they have a celebration. They have a dinner to honor St. Barbara. And everybody gets together in the artillery community. They all have a feast together, as well as they proclaim the new members of the Order of St. Barbara. And there is celebration. There is entertainment and everything else that occurs during this type of celebration. Now, but where the heck did artillery come from? Where did the Marine Corps artillery come from? Let's take a look at that and find out exactly where and how this even happened. In the beginning, there was chaos, and the chaos was the infantry, the queen of battle. However, the queen was alone, and fear was with the infantry. So she cried out unto the Lord, saying, Lord, save us, for we are afraid. And the Lord heard her grunts and set some of the infantry on beasts of burden. And these he called cavalry. and the cavalry became armor. And when the Lord saw what he had done, he laughed, saying,
Well, you can't win them all.
As time passed, the infantry and the armor again cried out unto the Lord, saying, Lord, save us, for we are afraid. The Lord heard their cries and decided to end their weeping. The Lord said unto them,
I shall send unto you a race of men, noble in heart and spirit.
And the Lord created the field artillery and named them the king of battle. And the Lord said unto the infantry and the armor,
When it is dark, the king shall light your way. And when you need smoke, there shall be smoke. And when you need it to rain down death and destruction upon the enemy, you shall have it.
And the Lord gave the king big guns and big bullets. And the infantry and the armor were jealous, for they had none. And the Lord gave the field artillery rockets and missiles and nukes. And when the infantry and the armor saw this, they fell to their knees in awesome wonder, saying, Surely the Lord is on the side of field artillery, the king of battle. And the Lord said,
Check.
And now abide infantry, armor, and artillery. But the greatest of these is field artillery. To all my fellow artillerymen, happy St. Barbara's Day, and I hope you're able to celebrate, have a cold one, and drink one for me. Now, let's talk about today, December 7th. Back in 1941 was when Pearl Harbor was attacked. So no moment in history of the United States cast a longer shadow than Pearl Harbor. Well, until now, when the Twin Towers were attacked. But this is about Pearl Harbor. So let's focus on what happened then. Remembering this has become a national imperative, a patriotic duty of the American people, and reminding us that the duty has become a ritual of the media and the political discourse, and is repeated so often that so many ways it's become part of a routine of communal life in the United States. So what actually happened? Let's remember what happened that day. Now, for the longest time during that time, there was a long fuse between Japan and the United States and in the Hawaiian Islands. This tangled relationship between the United States and Japan began with the forced opening of Japan in the 19th century, and this was courtesy of Commodore Matthew Perry and this black ships of his squadron. Japan's sudden exposure to the outside world after centuries of isolation generated a helter-skelter period of transformation. A revolutionary era in which Japan threw overboard many of its oldest traditions and built itself into a technologically advanced industrial state with modern systems of administration and government and a very, very powerful military. Japan's rise to power status was very, very rapid, with victorious wars over China during 1894 to 95, Russia in 1904 to 1905, as well as successful and subsidiary role in the side of allies in World War I, which was in 1914 to 1918. So again and again, Japan struck quickly to win wars over these larger and theoretically more powerful opponents. The very success of Japan enjoyed, however, placed the island empire squarely in sights of other great powers. And they generated an increasingly tense strategic rivalry with the United States for domination of the Pacific. Now, this was the long fuse of the Great Pacific War during 1941 to 1945. The long-term background to Japan's attack on Pearl Harbor on December 7th of 1941. Now, sitting in the Japanese's crosshairs that fateful Sunday morning was not only the U.S. Pacific Fleet, but the Hawaiian Islands, an independent kingdom with a long and proud history of its own, then discovered by the West and dubbed a Sandwich Islands. Hawaii only became a U.S. possession in the 1890s, and when a rebellion by the Anglo population of the islands rose up and to revolt against the rule of Queen Liliuokalani, declaring a Republic of Hawaii. The rebels then requested an annexation by the United States, which this took place in 1898. And since then, a new society had grown up in the native islanders, Americans, and Japanese immigrants on those islands. The economy during that time was very, very robust. Based on the island's numerous sugar cane plantations, Hawaii also saw an increasingly strong U.S. naval presence, which was a crucial comment came in 1940 about this. As tensions built between the United States and Japan, President Franklin D. Roosevelt ordered the U.S. Pacific Fleet to transfer from its home port in San Diego, California, to Pearl Harbor in Hawaii. Now, it was a fateful decision for all the parties concerned that the United States, Japan, and Hawaii itself during this time. From mid-1940, when FDR moved the U.S. Pacific Fleet from San Diego to Pearl Harbor, long simmering tensions between the United States and Japan had reached a new state of intensity. Japan had embroiled into a brutal war of conquest in China since 1937 and had overrun such of North China. Now, as well as most of the port cities along China's long coastline, the Japanese army was badly overstretched. Now, however, it could neither protect the supplies lines to the rear nor effectively control the territories that it occupied. So its response was terror against Chinese civilians, hoping to cow them into submission. Now, the policy of the three alls were the order of the day: kill all, burn all, loot all. So cities who resisted, like Nanjing in 1937, they suffered consequences, with the Japanese troops slaughtering hundreds of thousands of innocent civilians. Still, China fought to under the leadership of Chiang Kai-shek and his nationalist army along with their allies. The communist forces of Mao Zedong determined to help China and halt the Japanese aggression on the Asian mainland. FDR then waged economic warfare against Japan. He hoped that embargoes on arms in 1937, scrap iron in 1938, and eventually oil in 1941 would wound that Japanese economy insufficiently to halt Japan's war against China. His own advisors weren't sure how to proceed the situation. Should the United States follow a policy of strength, warning the Japanese against the consequences if they continued this kind of aggression, or should there be a more conciliatory approach of negotiations leading to a long-term understanding between both of the countries? Now, Japan, for its part, was growing very, very impatient. Stalemated by Chinese resistance with over 1 million Japanese troops trapped in the quicksand of a war they could not win. Japan just needed to find a solution for a strategic crisis. As Adolf Hitler's armies rampaged across Europe, overrunning Germany's neighbors in 1939, 1940, and threatening to invade the British Isles, the European colonial empires in Asia lay nearly undefended. Ripe for the picking, the Malaya Peninsula, the Dutch East Indies, Indochina, rich sources of raw materials lay in them: rubber, tin, and oil, and precious lifeblood for any modern economy. So they were going to take advantage of this. Perhaps the time had come to reach out, pluck these bulls of rice, as they refer to them, to take them off of the shelf and finally secure the resources that were necessary to end the war in China. Now, at the same time, Japan's leaders knew that such a policy would lead to war with the United States. As Japanese negotiators came to Washington for talks with the United States Secretary of State Cordell Hull in late 1941, military planners back in Tokyo had already decided to roll on the iron dice. They needed to launch a great strike, one that would both seize the Western colonies and ensure the U.S. could not and would not intervene. Now, as they surveyed a map of the Pacific, their gaze came to rest on the tiny spot in the Great Ocean, which was Pearl Harbor. Pearl Harbor was a great gamble for Japan, believe it or not. And especially for the Imperial Japanese Navy, it was also a piece of skilled military planning, the work of Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto. Japan dispatched all 6 of his precious fleet carriers. Now, they went across 3,000 miles of open ocean in secrecy, with the fleet arriving a few hundred miles north of the Hawaiian Islands. Now, think about that for a second. They went that whole entire distance undetected. Nobody saw this coming. Now, I understand that technology wasn't what it is today. Now today with all the satellites and all those things going on, you would be able to see all these aircraft carriers coming across the ocean and heading towards the Hawaiian Islands. So these carriers launched their aircraft early on a Sunday morning. U.S. forces were completely unprepared. And in less than 90 minutes, Japanese planes destroyed or damaged 19 U.S. warships and 300 aircraft. And they killed over 2,400 United States servicemen. That's a lot for 90 minutes of fighting. But that has to say because they were very, very much unprepared. So almost half of the dead were crewmen from the battleships, the USS Arizona, which sank within 5 minutes after a bomb struck the forward magazine that ignited more than 1 million pounds of ammunition. And the ships remain still lie on the waters of Pearl Harbor, which is a constant memorial to that terrible morning. And if you ever get a chance to go to Hawaii, you'll be able to take a ferry out there to be able to see the USS Arizona still sitting there in the bottom of the harbor. Now, with the U.S. Navy temporarily out of the way, a massive Japanese offensive overran the European and the colonial empires throughout Asia. Hong Kong, Malaya, the Dutch East, New Guinea, U.S. possessions too came under attack. The Philippines, the major U.S. base in Asia, Guam, and also in Wake Island. The Japanese assault seemed irresistible, and at 2 places there were mass surrender. In Singapore and the tip of Malaya, 80,000 British, Indian, and Australian troops, they went into captivity in February of 1942. And on the Philippines, attacking Japanese forces outmaneuvered a combined U.S.-Filipino army under General Douglas MacArthur. So the defenders retreated to the Bataan Peninsula and finally onto the tiny Corridor Island. MacArthur evacuated the island, vowing, however, "I shall return," but his entire force of 75,000 men surrendered in April of 1942. The worst military defeat that was recorded in military U.S. history. Their Japanese captors now subjected them to a brutal 65-mile forced march to POW camps in the Philippines, hence the infamous Bataan Death March. In the course of just 5 days, at least 5,000 died, and perhaps many more on grisly sign of what is to come of what the Japanese called the Great Pacific War. So man, imagine that, having to march that distance to go just because they wanted to take those POW camps, and those 5,000 that died, and like I said, perhaps it was way, way more. So it's amazing, not what they went through, but man, that sucks. That straight sucks what they did to these individuals just because they wanted to take them to where they needed to go. Now, victory, defeat, shame, infamy, even today, the memory of these events is contradictory and contested every single day. Different societies, they tend to remember events in their history very, very differently, and it is especially true for traumatic moments. Japan and the United States now have been friends and allies for decades. They welcomed change from 1930 to the 1940s, and nevertheless, the lessons, the legacies, and memory of the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor is going to continue to influence contemporary politics, diplomacy, and strategy in the future. Now, especially with the way things are today with Japan and the United States, things have gotten a little hairy here in the past couple of years. But Pearl Harbor is just a reminder of what is capable of being done by a country who tries to overtake other countries and nations for their own gain, for what they want to do. And, they always say that history tends to repeat itself, but hopefully, politically, they're able to settle their differences and be able to continue with peace as we move forward throughout the next couple of years. So remember that today is December 7th, and take a little bit of time of your day to remember all of these service members that did lose their lives on this tragic day when the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor. Are you looking for a photographer who can capture the most important moments in your life? Look no further than Miguel Saenz Photography. Miguel Saenz is an award-winning photographer with a passion for capturing the beauty and emotions of weddings, family portraits, and special events. With years of experience and a creative eye, Miguel Saenz will create stunning images that you'll treasure for years to come. Whether you're looking for a traditional wedding album, a unique family portrait, or a professional headshot for your business, Miguel Saenz Photography has the expertise to bring your vision to life. From the initial consultation to the final product, Miguel Saenz will work with you every step of the way to ensure that your images reflect your unique style and personality. Don't settle for mediocre photographs that simply document an event. Trust Miguel Saenz Photography to create timeless images that capture the essence of your special moments. Book your session today and experience the magic of Miguel Saenz Photography. Visit Miguel Saenz Photography online at miguelsaenzphotography.com to see examples of his work and schedule your appointment today.
What we're gonna do right here is go back. Way back into time.
Last week we looked at the 20th and 21st of March as the division had moved and progressed in heading into Iraq, and now we're making their way down towards Baghdad. Today, let's take a look at Task Force Ripper and what their role was and what they actually did now that they were already in Iraq and heading their way down there into Baghdad. Harkening back to its Operation Desert Shield roots, Colonel Hummer from RCT-7 was often referred to as Task Force Ripper. Built around the 7th Marine Regiment, it had nearly 5,200 Marines and 1,000 vehicles when it crossed into Iraq. Among the units of the task force were 2 Mechanized Battalion Task Force, 3rd Battalion, 4th Marines, 3-4, commanded by Lieutenant Colonel Brian McCoy, and 3rd Battalion, 7th Marines Regiment, 3-7, commanded by Lieutenant Colonel Mike Belcher, and 1 Motorized Battalion, 1st Battalion, 7th Marine Regiment, 1-7, commanded by Lieutenant Colonel Christopher Conlon. In addition, the RCT attached 1st Tank Battalion, commanded by Lieutenant Colonel Jim Carter, from Company D, 3rd LAR Command Battalions by Captain Gordon Miller, and elements of the 3rd Assault Amphibious Battalion. Supporting the RCT were the Marines and sailors from the Combat Service Support Company, CSSC 117. They were under the command of Captain Andy Bergen. 3rd Battalion, 11th Marines, commanded by Lieutenant Colonel Kirk Hims, was in direct support. Rounding out the organization for combat were units from the 1st and 2nd Combat Engineer Battalions, 3rd Civil Affairs Group, 1st Radio Battalion, supported by the 1st UK Division Signals Detachment, a VMU-I Remote Receiver Team, a 1st Intelligence Battalion Detachment of Human Intelligence and Explosion Teams, HETS, and elements of the PSYOPS Company added just before the order of the displace of the DAs released. The Kuwaiti-Iraqi border was RCT-7's line of departure. The original plans was for simultaneously attack from the 1st Tanks and 3-7 crossing the border through breach lanes, Orange 1-5, near the terminus of Kuwait Highway 80. The remainder of the RCT would follow, continuing the attack north along the 2 axes orientated on the main thoroughfares, Highway 8 and Highway 31. Once through the breach, first tanks would eliminate the tanks and the APCs of the Iraqi 1st Mechanized Division and support the attack onto the Basra International Airport. The task of 3-7 was to clear the Iraqi 32nd Mechanized Infantry Brigade from its garrison to the south of the Aziz Zabrir. More importantly, 1-7 was focused on securing the crown jewel, the Zabrir Pumping Station Complex. This complex was a central pumping station in the South Rumalaya oil fields and received oil from the north and the west and pumped it to the offshore oil export terminals. It is the last strategic objective that had to be taken for the Marines to claim complete success in capturing the critical nodes of the South Rumalaya oil field infrastructure intact. The objectives of 3-4 included securing BIA and the northern bridges over the Sheet al-Bazra waterway. These bridges leading to the city of al-Bazra were key to supporting the attack of the 1st United Kingdom Division, 7th Armored Brigade, into the city. They were central to the blocking of the enemy's movements across the waterway in either direction. It was important to the division to set the Brits up for success in both the relief in place for their follow-on missions. RCT-7 bore the responsibility of delivering these bridges to them intact. The original plan was now modified because of the suspected Republican Guard Brigade threat north of the Safwan in RCT-7 zone. RCT-5 had already moved to the blocking position that would preclude the escape of any reinforced Republican Guard elements in the south. RCT-7 would attack to deliver the decisive blow. Instead of leading with an attack up Highway 80, 2 battalions, 1st tanks followed by 3-4, were redirected to the west of Jabal Sanaa, where they would cross the border using the green breach lanes originally created for elements of 3rd LAR Battalion, 11th Marines. The remainder of the RCT would hold place and cross at the original sites once the enemy threat had been reduced to an assault element. Only a Republican Guard threat had been destroyed. 3-4 and 1st tanks would continue their attack to the Shat al-Bazra, effectively sealing off the remainder of the division zones from any actions on the part of the preliminary fighters of the al-Bazra or an Iraqi 6th Armored Division. The time of attack was set, and RCT-7 crossed the line of departure at 0300 Zulu on 21 March. 11th Marines waited the main effort, now shifted to RCT-7. With the mass fires of 3 artillery battalions, leapfrogging battalions to keep pace with RCT-7's tank and mechanized battalions. 11th Marines delivered unrelenting artillery fires with devastating effects, stripping the last enemy defenders' will to resist. The RCT-7 main effort 1st Tank Battalion, Tiger, crossed through the breach time lane on a schedule and headed north past Jabal Sanam and the Safwan airfield. Movements across this part of Iraq took a bit longer than expected. However, as Lieutenant Colonel Jim Charlier led Tiger between minefields and bauxite mining pits to hit its mark midway into the flank of the suspected enemy positions, Tiger took up a position from which it could strike into the flank of the Republican Guard Brigade, reportedly arrayed along Highway 8. But they quickly found that there were no T-72 tanks on the strike. The report that had been changed the entire division's scheme of maneuver was false. Once all RCT's units were across the line of departure, and 1st Tanks and 3-4 had swung to the north and crown jewel of the RCT-7 units, assumed their originally planned attack routes. Tiger, followed by 3-4, moved north along Highway 8, while 3-7, followed by 1-7, moved north along Highway 31. The Ripper Tactical CP and TAC established itself 13 kilometers north of Jabal Sanam, in between the 2 highways, and took control of the fight. Once the TAC was in place, the RCT-7 main CP moved into Iraq to link up with the TAC. Attacking in the wake of the earlier RCT-5 attack and the significant shaping effort, 1st Tank Battalion's movement over the next few hours was characterized by what appeared to be a collapsing conventional enemy. Some uniformed Iraqi infantrymen fought, some surrendered, and a large number of APC tanks and artillery pieces were found very recently abandoned. The battalion's main body was immersed in civilians, many of whom had obviously just tossed aside uniforms for civilian clothes. Some appeared to be very happy with their recent release from the military, while some seemed to look as if they were watching and waiting for an opportunity to rejoin the fight. This was RCT's introduction to the unique face of enemy resistance in Iraq, one that required discipline on the part of all division Marines. Blue Diamond declined to kill hundreds of Iraqi citizen soldiers unnecessarily or take thousands of conscript prisoners. Throughout the campaign, the division chose to ruthlessly destroy only those that took arms and fought against it, disarming and releasing those Iraqis who just wished to end the fighting and return home. No longer posing a threat, coaxial machine gun fire and tank main guns quickly destroyed the relatively few active enemy infantrymen. Estimated enemy casualties for the Marines were only approximately 35 to 40 enemy personnel and armored vehicles encountered. By 1300 Zulu, all garrison positions of the 41st Armored Brigade have been cleared of organized enemy resistance. Attached to 1st Tank Battalion, Lima Company 3-4, commanded by Captain Matt Watt, continued the attack towards the Al-Bazrah bridges. With darkness rapidly approaching, Lima was engaged by enemy dismounted infantry and armored vehicles in the vicinity of the Al-Shabaria barracks, the headquarters of the 31st Mechanized Brigade. This enemy was quickly destroyed. As Lima presented east, they encountered extensive civilian and military traffic on the road between Al-Zabra'a and Al-Bazrah. They continued to attack until they were blocking positions in the major Al-Bazrah bridges. Now, no reinforcements could enter the division's area of operations without fighting through the blocking position, something the enemy would try and fail to accomplish many times over the next 24 hours. Captain Wyatt and Lima Company, with a tank platoon attached, continued to fight a close quarters battle in the northern Al-Bazrah bridge site throughout the night with dismounted infantry on the near and far side. The ground near the bridge was marshalling and restricted movement of tanks, AAVs, and Humvees, making the establishment of a dispersed integrated defense difficult. The company had to contend with forces retreating into the Al-Bazrah, as well as preliminary fighters coming out of Al-Bazrah seeking to join the fight to the south of the west that night. Lima Company destroyed more than 12 technicals and troop transport, 100 dismounted infantry, and several artillery pieces as the key bridge into Al-Bazrah. With the complex movement across the border complete, RCT-7 focused on seizing the Crown Jewel and defeating the remainder of the 51st Mechanized Division. The attack towards Al-Zabra'a and Al-Bazrah unfolded as planned. 3rd Battalion 7th Marines moved up Highway 31, turned right, and sliced through farmlands to find a lightly defended 32nd Mechanized Brigade garrison. For the next several hours, the battalion continued to clear the garrison associated with the brigade. Resistance was sporadic, and it appeared most equipment had simply been abandoned. The Iraqi soldiers either surrendered or trying to escape dressed as civilians. Iraqi uniforms were found strewn about in the fighting holes with abandoned AK-47s, rocket propelled grenades, and other gear. The frightened soldiers had rapidly donned civilian clothes and left, in just enough time to survive the direct fire attack of 3-7. Several members of the battalion's logistics trains were severely injured when they encountered the enemy minefield. HNC Leo Rea, a corpsman with Battalion A station, recounts. After driving most of the day, we were starting to set into our position. After a couple of unwakeful hours, we heard a loud explosion, and immediately those famous two words, "Corpsman up." Staff Sergeant Alva had stepped on some kind of a mine and was lying on the ground, critically injured. We rushed across the minefield to stabilize his injuries and prepare him for an urgent CASEVAC. Several minutes later, we heard a second loud explosion. HM3 Alanese had also stepped on a mine as he helped set up a BAS of care for Staff Sergeant Alva. 3 corpsmen had been injured from the blast in addition to the 4 Marines from the first explosion. We were about to be tested. After all we said and done, all Marines and sailors survived their injuries and will live to talk about it. Staff Sergeant Alva and HM3 Albanese were both evacuated to the American hospital in Germany. Each of these men lost a leg with their wounds. The remaining casualties were treated in theater by the 47th Combat Surgical Hospital and eventually returned to their unit. These incidents reinforced the dangers and conditions that all Marines and sailors that they entered Iraq were to encounter. Before the war was over, many more members of the division were to be wounded or killed by mines and unexploded ordnance. 1st Battalion 7th Marines, supported by combat engineers, PSYOPs, and civil affairs teams, attacked next to seize the crown jewel. As the lead combat combined arms anti-tank, or CAT, team moved forward in the objective, all indicators were that the site was unmanaged. As 1-7 secured the key elements of the VEST complex of the PSYOPs and civil affairs teams, broadcast messages to the workers and residents of the remain clear of the Marines. Key supervisors in the facility were identified and assisted the Marines in safeguarding the pumping station. Finally, the last of the strategic oilfield infrastructure elements were secure. After securing the pumping station complex, 1-7 set out patrols to the outskirts of the city of Az-Zabriyah. Cat Red, led by Lieutenant Joshua Bates, approached the city and crossed a road intersection. Suddenly, an RPG narrowly missed the lead vehicle and impacted 20 meters beyond the patrol. Immediately, all Cat vehicles and dismounts established firing positions and returned suppressive fire. One dismounted Cat team spotted a T-55 down the block and ran into a courtyard in order to get the AT-4 shot. The team began receiving sporadic small arms fire from a nearby building, while additional Cat dismounted joined teams in the suppressing of the building. A tow vehicle destroyed the T-55. 7 more T-55s were spotted around and destroyed tank. A gun truck continued to provide suppressive fire on the building, with Mark 19 rounds as the rest of the team destroyed the tanks. Cat completed the patrol without taking a casualty, leaving 10 T-55 tanks burning. On the northern flank of 1st Tanks 3-4, under Lieutenant Colonel Brian McCoy, fought through the sporadic resistance past Shalia Airfield and Basra Refinery to the outskirts of the Barashara International Airport, or BIA. The battalion was organized with Bravo 1st Tanks Battalion. For the tanks of the Shalia Airfield, Bravo Company turned east, deployed on the line against threats in the open, lining up to the flank of Charlie Company 1st Tanks Kilo Company 3-4, continue forward BIO Road to the left flank. Just to the west of the Basra Oil Refinery, a tank platoon attached to Kilo Company made contact with enemy T-55s and MTLBs, destroying 13 MTLBs, 3 T-55s, and approximately 35 dismounted enemy. Surrendering Iraqi soldiers were simply disarmed and pointed south to make their own way to the EPW camp. Approaching the refinery, 3-4 encountered enemy resistance comprised primarily of dismounted soldiers and bunkers next to unoccupied vehicles. Several T-55s also engaged in approaching Marines. The minimum amount of fire necessary was detected at the threats in the refinery complex, leaving it largely undamaged for its return to the Iraqi people in accordance with the division's greater mission. Remaining elements of 3-4 continued to push towards the east. Even though the coalition did not intend to operate from BIA, the airport needed to be cleared of enemy units to permit uninterrupted relief by the 1st UK Division. BIA was also an important objective from the psychological perspective. Part of the battalion, including 2 task-organized companies, Bravo and India, supported by the battalion TAC CP, led by Operations Officer Major Martin Wedenor, an obstacle-clearing detachment and a section of 81mm mortars moved towards the Cloverleaf intersection just south of the BIA. After a brief engagement with enemy soldiers on the southeastern corner of the airport, Bravo turned its main guns in the vicinity of the Cloverleaf, quickly dispensing with 8 T-55s, 3 MTLBs, and 20 Iraqi infantry. At 21:23 Zulu, Bravo called the Cloverleaf South the BIA secure. For most of the remainder of the night, Bravo remained in its hasty blocking position at the Cloverleaf, overlooking the highway bridge across the Shah Bazarah waterway. After conducting a link up the coordination with India Company west of the Cloverleaf, Kilo moved against the airport. Its tank platoon pressed forward to the berm of the scout of the breach site, moving under cover from 81mm mortars. Upon detecting MTLBs, the troops in the open immediately suppression fires were called. As soon as the rounds from the regimental suppression mission lifted, Kilo moved through the parting of the fence and fought its way supported by fire precision from India's movement through the breach. The attack destroyed a dozen armored vehicles and included RCT-7's first javelin engagement of the war, when Lance Corporal Adam Shuley destroyed a BMP-1 on the airfield. India and Kilo companies continued to use surface and air to destroy sustained enemy resistance at the airfield. India undertook the detailed clearing of the buildings that made up intentional airport complexes. During this operation, India Company discovered underground military complex and human intelligence exploitation teams, or the HET, led by Chief Warrant Officer Steve Blanford, deployed to ascertain its purpose. On the rooms discovered was an obvious torture chamber with a battery and cables hooked to bed springs. Kilo Company maintained its support for the clearing by moving a new support by fire precision as India Company advanced. At 0818 Zulu, 3-4 reported that Basra International Airport was secure. Soon thereafter, the relief in place began with British forces. So wow, we can see that they are moving along, and they're able to move now that they've secured the airfield, the oil structure, and the mission for the division is starting to come into place a lot more. And soon, the division is going to be able to reach Baghdad. Hero highlight. Robert Howard McCard was born in Syracuse, New York on 25 November 1918. He attended elementary school and 2 years of high school, where he took a business course. He played both football and baseball in high school. He was employed as a bartender at the Bear Mountain Inn in Owana, New York, before he enlisted in the Marine Corps. Enlisting in the Marine Corps on 18 December 1939, he was sent to sea school after he completed boot camp. Upon the successful completion of that school, he went abroad the cruiser USS Tuscaloosa and served a year at sea. While with the Tuscaloosa, he won a $5 prize for being a member of the gun crew, which placed second in a competition for short-range practice with a 5-inch anti-aircraft gun. Promoted to private first class on 2 July 1940, he was temporarily made a sergeant when he went on recruiting duty on May 1941. Assigned to Central Recruiting District, Sergeant McCard served in the Centralia, Illinois recruiting office. Reverting to his rank of private first class when he left the recruiting service in December of 1941, PFC McCard served at the Greek Lakes, Illinois Naval Training Station for 4 months and then went to the training center at Quantico, Virginia for a year. He was promoted to corporal in January 1943 and to sergeant on April of that same year. In April, he went to the 4th Tank Battalion of the 4th Marine Division, which was then being formed at Camp Lejeune, North Carolina. It was with this organization that he was to learn the country's highest award, to lose his life. Sergeant McCard left the United States on 13 January 1944 and on 31 January landed in Kwajalein in the Marshall Islands. From then until 26 February, he took part in the battles of Ingret, Inamonet, and Namur Islands. Leaving the Marshalls, he went to the Hawaiian Islands for 2 months and then sailed for Saipan. D-Day was 15 June 1944. On the 16th, Gunnery Sergeant McCard had made platoon sergeant and gunnery sergeant in 2 successive days in May while acting as platoon sergeant of a tank company, was participating in an advance when his tank was put out of action by a battery of Japanese 77mm guns. Cut off from the rest of the platoon, Gunnery Sergeant McCord brought all his tank weapons to bear on the enemy, but the intensity of the Japanese fire caused him to order his crew out of the escape hatch. While they made their escape, the courageous tank commander hurled hand grenades at the enemy until his supply was exhausted. Severely wounded, Gunnery Sergeant McCord nevertheless dismantled one of the tank's machine guns, then faced the enemy again and delivered such effective fire that he killed 16 of the enemy before himself was killed. He gallantly gave his life for his country. He was buried in the 4th Marine Division Cemetery at Saipan and later re-entered in the National Cemetery of the Pacific in 1948. For his supreme sacrifice that June day, the President of the United States, Franklin D. Roosevelt, conferred upon him posthumously the greatest military honor, the Medal of Honor. The medal was presented to his widow at Central Illinois on 10 April 1945 by the Commandant of the 9th Naval District. The quarterdeck Task Force Ripper was handling its business now that it crossed the border and was securing and going down there to the oil fields and that airfield to ensure the success of the division's mission now that they were all getting ready to head into there. So what can I say? Man, it brings back so many memories when it talks to me about all those things that we did and the division conducted throughout those initial couple of days when we first went into country. So amazing. The division is moving on and continuing to do its things. And next week, we're going to talk about the Recon Battalion and RCT-1 and how they played their role into the rest of the way for the mission to be successful. This week in Hero Highlights, we talked about Gunnery Sergeant Robert Howard McCord of the United States Marine Corps, a tanker, a guy that was inside of a tank and gallantly gave his life so his crew could go ahead and get out of his tank, out of the escape hatch. But he did destroy some tanks, and man, what heroism. You know, what balls for the things that he did in order to ensure that his Marines were going to be safe and be able to get out of the tank and not get injured during that battle when they were conducting. So it's amazing. It's amazing how these stories of heroism continue to have kind of the same kind of pattern for all these individuals of what they did, because their life was not as important as those individuals that were to the left and to the right of them. And to me, that's just so very important, because even today in the Marine Corps, and I'm sure that in any other service as well, that is still something of importance to us, that we value the life of our comrades more than we do our own. Let's not forget to take a little bit of our time today and remember all those lives that were lost on December 7th in Pearl Harbor back in 1941. And as well as all my cannon cockers, all my haulers and bearers and shooters of long-range weaponry, archery, all those things. I hope that all of you had an outstanding and happy St. Barbara's Day. To all of my new listeners, thank you guys for joining us here this week and enjoying our episode. Today's episode drug on a little bit, but we were able to go ahead and do the celebration of St. Barbara so that way you have an understanding. And of course, we got to remember all those great service members in Pearl Harbor. Thank you guys for continuing to make my podcast a growing success. And like always, remember that you're able to listen to this podcast on any of the podcasting applications that are out there, or simply just Google the Quarterdeck with Gunny Signs, and you will be directed to all of the podcasting applications that you're more than capable of listening to our podcast on. Always remember that we have our Facebook page, the Quarterdeck with Gunny Signs, where you're able to go in there, ask any questions, or post any comments about any of the episodes that we have every single week. So to all of you, I thank you, and I wish all of you a happy weekend, and spend time with the family, because it is the most important, and you got to share it with them, because we don't know how much longer we have with them or how quickly our days with our family can simply end. So until next week, this is Miguel, the Gunny Signs, sounding Liberty Call.
Get off the bus!
I do solemnly swear that I will support and defend the United States. Constitution of the United States. Against all enemies, foreign and domestic.